Hi, AJ. Welcome to the EO Wonder podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Kalika. So pleased to be here. Thank you.
You have had such an amazing story. You're a trailblazing entrepreneur. You've combined art theory with ancient history, with this entrepreneurial hustle, and your journey is really nothing short of inspiring. Tell us a little bit about how you got here and maybe some challenges along the way.
Definitely. Challenges would be a great word to start with. I think no good entrepreneurial journey would be complete without that kind of a prompt, right? The challenge is everything. But I will also say that, thank God, I mean, I've got genetics here as well. I'm a fourth generation entrepreneur, as far as we know. But that doesn't mean wealth transfer. That doesn't mean I stepped into some existing fourth generation business. I'm a fourth generation bootstrapped entrepreneur. So my grandfather bootstrapped, my dad bootstrapped, and now I've bootstrapped as well. And so something about the formative stages of being 10 years old and learning the difference from dad between a prospect and a client, for example, right? Those kinds of early lessons in life are indivisible, I would say, or inextricable from my formation story. But again, challenges everything. I mean, if it weren't for academic challenges, if it weren't for social challenges, even like athletic and physical and personal challenges, just growing up, right? So again, without those types of issues or domains to conquer, so to speak, I for sure wouldn't be able to have these conversations. And these accomplishments that we're talking about, again, are nothing compared to what I would call the mountaineering of achieving, in the face of things like having to move across the country or around the world, or being on the verge of the brink from a family perspective with a spouse. Or my wife and I are still married, of course, but the point is that stuff isn't easy. So we can take a very deep dive into all of these aspects, but I guess I'd ask you, knowing your audience, your audience better than I do, where do you think would be a direction to pull in terms of a thread there? Should we go into the personal challenges front, or do you want to go more into the direction of what you called accomplishments? I definitely would leave it to you.
Well, I think that since we are an EO, and everyone loves the top 5% and bottom 5%, how about we
Yes.
start with the bottom 5% and then go to the
Super.
top 5%? What do you think?
I love that. I
Yeah.
love
Also,
that.
I just wanted to just say, you said you're fourth generation bootstrap. Aren't you glad though that you weren't handed this? Because I mean,
Yes.
the people that I know that have been handed their success, it's almost like there is just something missing from their life, don't you
Mm-hmm.
think?
Mm-hmm.
Like it is really these challenges when you're mountaineering, you're summiting, that really makes you grateful for what you have. And also, if everything was taken away from you, AJ, come on, you could bring it back, right?
Because now we know how.
Right?
Right. 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 And
Yeah.
you're absolutely correct. In those multi-generational companies where the heir is the successor, is the heir is the successor of junior and senior and so on and so forth. That missing element also, I think, is a key reason that we have issues in politics today, and we have issues at the global level that we obviously won't be getting into on this call. But generally speaking, I think you're exactly right. The path to success, when one forges it for themselves, is also something that creates a more benevolent world and domain. One has to learn entrepreneurship by learning it, by doing it. And so in that process, I can jump into a few of the what you'd call the lower 5% as well, the challenges, the personal stuff. And I would say the first would for sure be my own field of study. And so we can get into that. But imagine being an eighth grader, not even, I think I was seventh grade, and wanting more than anything to go into the sciences. Okay. So fancy yourself a scientist, a would be scientist at the age of, say, 13 or whatever year. And after a month or two in this advanced placement science course that you were so excited to take, and this was me, this is a real story, the professor, the teacher at school says, that Herkert kid just doesn't have the right stuff. We're going to have to bump him down to normal science class. And it was like, wow, that is heavy. And so, again, before I even thought about starting a business or whatever, those are the kinds of things that just happen in the real world. And it could have been the teacher, it could have been me, I could have said something wrong, or they could have just needed to make space for the head count to work out. But the point there is that that led me in the opposite direction. I said, forget it then. If there's challenge in science and math, or even perceived challenge, then I'm going to double down into the arts. And that's where my mom was very active, and she still is. She's a world-renowned Rosemall artist and painter, and so she had me taking classes at the Chicago Art Institute, like in the basement, like during summer camp kind of thing. Like my friends would be at the YMCA, and I would be there learning oil paints and how to compose a watercolor or pointillist painting or whatever. So, anyways, I leaned into it and I started studying the classics and Latin and archaeology and so on and so forth. But that's just, again, at a young age, that's the kind of thing that you don't really think about being so formative. But then we'll double down there and imagine being an 18-year-old then telling your girlfriends or boyfriends, I suppose, parents that, yep, I'm going to be studying the history of art and art theory. And you're talking to then at that point, maybe a lawyer and a doctor. And they say, what the heck are you going to do with that? This doesn't register in the professional services world. And so that was another challenge, was even being, we'll say, the prodigal son. My dad is a very successful technologist and entrepreneur in his own right. And so with that, saying, hey, Dad, I'm going to study art, it was the same kind of concept, like, what the heck? But then add that other layer, the third layer of social pressure, right? So girlfriend's parents is one thing, my own family is another. But when you talk about, other people who have careers and, folks that would say, you know, it doesn't matter. We don't need to get into who they are, where they were from, but other people in my life that could be friends of friends or whatever were quite condescending about field of study. How could you possibly be studying art? Good luck with that, so on and so forth. And again, that's the type of challenge that it's not just like, oh, today was a tough day. It's like, oh, this again for 5 years, for 10 years, really, because that's how long it takes to get an advanced degree, right? So I was in the academic world for about 8 years, and I would say about 7.5 of those years were riddled with trolling, if you want to call it that, just complete challenge from almost every dimension until the business had really started to take off. And then it was like, oh, now we get it, so things started to click there. So that would be one aspect of challenge, is just finding the path and then staying on that path amidst the face of complete, everybody saying, don't do this, or why are you doing this, or challenging this, and having to stay the course. Like, not easy right there. Sounds a lot like running a startup, So that would be my first area that I for sure would caution folks and say, if you're feeling what I felt there at all, you're probably doing it right. Another aspect is if you're going against the grain in such a way that folks are saying, why are you doing what you're doing? Again, you're probably doing something right, because look at the 99% of people that ended up in those general studies programs taking an average business degree or whatever may have at this point an average career. So perhaps just desserts. I don't know. We don't need to get into the Schadenfreude aspect of that, but you see my point. The next component, though, the next dimension, of course, is after, I was 23, 24 years old or whatever, I started this company and things started to pick up. Also started a family, right? And so became married by age 24, 25. And now it's been 10 years. And for sure can just report a roller coaster. I mean, we've moved across the country 3 times, one of which in duress, where it was like, hey, we're going to pull a ripcord here and hope and pray that where we go and where we land is going to be safe and good. And, that was from Seattle down to San Francisco. And that's a big jump, right? After having been established and married and so on and so forth. Having a child in the midst of that, and then another one on the way, and then saying, oh, it actually wasn't so good in San Francisco. We're going to go back to Madison, Wisconsin, which is another 2,500 miles. Oh, and then we're going to have our second child there, So anyway, speaking about just the challenge of building company, building brand, building personal brand, but then also, multi-million-dollar lines of business and products. Well, do that with a family in tow, a young family, and you are sure to test every limit of every dimension of those relationships. And so again, if there are people on this listening to the podcast now who kind of resonate there, I would say that that is one of the key reasons that EO exists, is that that personal side of things is very difficult to talk about in the public sense. You know, people say, "Oh, you're running an entrepreneurial company that's very successful. Like it must be great." You know, is something that people say, or they'll. I've heard people are just jealous. They're like, "Yeah, I'm jealous that you guys get to do what you get to do in that, group of business owner." And I think at the end of the day, it's like, are you though? Do you know what it takes and what it really costs? From a physical, personal, spiritual, mental level. So those would be two areas where I think we could delve in further for sure, without necessarily needing to go into more complications of, it's like an onion, right? Of what those 5% on the more challenging formative side of things have to be. But again, happy to speak more in terms of where you'd like to take this. So your audience best, so I'll follow your lead more.
Oh, you know what's really interesting about all these challenges that you have is people assume that you're a successful entrepreneur, that you have it right in other areas of life. You know,
Yeah.
isn't that true? That there's a circle of life, and they think just because you're succeeding in one area, they think that everything else must be hunky dory,
Yes, must have it dialed in.
right? Yeah.
If your show is going so well, then so is your profit and loss, so to speak, right?
Right, right. And I think that that's all. If you have not gone through that journey, we assume that. But since we're both serial entrepreneurs, I completely understand. But if, definitely someone looking from the outside, when they see your success, they don't see the 120-hour work weeks that you're probably putting in. The sleepless nights because you have a newborn.
Yes.
All that. Bootstrapping, right? Putting everything on the line for this one idea or several ideas that you feel so strongly about. But you know what? Let's move back a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about what Squiggle, what TruScribe does. I mean, I introduced it in my intro, but maybe from your perspective, like how did that idea emerge? And then how did that also take you to being the sixth CEO of the Portfolio 313 software?
Well, it is all tied together. So I'm glad we got to start with, kind of the challenges, because those challenges started again, even before I was in university, right, to pick my track of academic pursuit. And by the time, I don't know, maybe I was about ready to finish my master's degree, I was visiting with my brother-in-law, and he said, "Hey, check out this project I'm working on with a client." And it was a whiteboard video was the medium of the product that he was creating. And so I said, "Whoa, dude, like this is really cool. There's a lot more here, quote unquote, than just a video or just drawings or whatever you'd say." And long story short, about 60, 90 days later, that one video became his client's most successful marketing, bar none. And again, me being in an entrepreneurial environment at the time, I kind of thought, well, I would join up with you if you were offering, and he did, and we created this product line together, which is known as TruScribe, and that's the agency. And basically, what we did then from that point was apply the things that I was studying, the things that he had practical expertise in, and then we'll say, contributions and insights of experts. As I mentioned, my father has a strong track record in enterprise resource planning and ERP. And so he came in and said, well, here's kind of how you might manage to scale, and so on and so forth. But the point there is that by pursuing something that I knew I was passionate about and leaning into the kind of strengths that I had within the family, if you will, we were able to forge a brand that remained debt free for like our first 5 years before we even thought about taking on, funding or strategic partnerships in that way or whatever else. I mean, we grew to multi millions of, it was like over 3 million, I think, in our most successful year before again entering the next stage. And so that was like 30 some employees, 35, 40 plus employees, whatever it was. And all of that to deliver just one thing, which is thoughtful, impactful illustration. So for an art student who was pushed around a bit and, challenged quite aggressively by many, many people, all of a sudden, several years later, to be able to look at what we were doing and say, that's because of the challenges. that it works. All right. It's quite a powerful place to be in terms of being holistic about all of it. Right. And so anyway, that's TruScribe for you. And it's whiteboard video with the superpower, I suppose, of academia, right? Of reasons behind what we're doing and design and how it looks and how it has an impact, so to speak. And then the authoring tool, which you mentioned, Squiggle. Squiggle is basically like a DIY version of TruScribe. So TruScribe is an agency. We will make things for the user or for the client. Whereas Squiggle is a tool that we are, as a software company, we are building and licensing. And then the end user could be a student, for example, somebody who could never work with an executive communications agency, but for sure they have a need to draw stuff, to illustrate, to create content. And so again, they both of these brands track back towards the concepts of illustration and storytelling, which again was an academic specialty of mine. And that's where I think a lot of this passion comes from, because it's something that I had to defend, before I even knew that there would be a professional application to this. I had to defend it to the most critical people, like my girlfriend's parents. You know what I mean? So that's some of the origin story for you.
Well, I don't think there's anyone who has not been on the internet that has not seen a whiteboard animation. And I love your mission. We draw words, ideas, and stories to change the way people see, think, feel, and act. And I also think that there's such a large education component to it as well. I learned so much from watching these whiteboard animation videos. Was that also something that it was really important to you to
You
educate?
learn, and I hope you're watching the right ones. And I bet I know you have a creative eye because we've spoken about your work as well. Uh, you can tell the ones that are done right. And you can also tell the ones that, just like any other media campaign, right? If you hire a bad photographer, you may as well not publish those pictures, right? If it's a bad shoot and you don't have the right content, don't post anything, right? It's that kind of way with whiteboard, especially because if those drawings are wrong or offensive or whatever, it for sure does brand damage. And I'll give you an example. Just 4 or 5 days ago, on my own LinkedIn feed, I tend to post, every so often, a couple times a week, about creative strategy and illustration. I shared a story of a Happy Veterans Day, like flag banner campaign that had been designed by somebody in a county in Florida. And that imagery was all Russian jets. And the flag was literally upside down. The American flag was like, the flag in distress imagery, right? And so instead of an F-16 and an eagle and this really patriotic imagery, it was a Russian jet silhouettes and again a flag in distress. That's just one example for you of how poor imagery or the wrong illustration can absolutely damage the brand. And so you can't imagine how many people were upset about that, calling the county, making complaints and so on and so forth. Whereas if you do it right, obviously that's where the brand lift comes into play. And so that's what we would like to focus on. But there are for sure perils, as you know, again, being in the creative space yourself. So basically, what I want to say about the illustration as a medium is that it dates back, my estimates are between 10,000 and 30,000 years of actual meaningful human history. But there's very likely aspects and elements that go from 30,000 to 100,000 years of human history of using illustration. Well, text is only as old as the Gutenberg printing press, which is maybe 600 or 700 years. So if you think about us, I guess they're calling us biological computers now, which is what we are. And we've all got our own internal large language model and visual processing and all these things. Well, we've been tuned to process pictures and drawings by anywhere from 100 to 200 times or 300 times as long and as intensely as text. So text is so new as to our biological supercomputer that we are. So of course, if you do it right and you do it well, it would serve as a superpower. It would serve as a way to communicate more with higher impact to drive greater return. And that's what our clients tell us. And so that's been the key to your exact point in the question, is that there for sure exists, a milieu of thoughtless, we'll say poor quality Fiverr.com kind of stuff. Sorry for that. But you know what I mean? Just the freelancers that are hey, we could do this, all the way up to professional levels. And there are business illustrators, as you know, who don't even take calls. They're by appointment only and invite only kind of solution. And so, with all of that said, it's a strong focus on how the stuff works, what makes it work, and keeping it innovating so that it works more and not less over time. So, have you ever, by the way, have you ever participated? Have you ever done one yourself? Have you ever made a whiteboard video or used one for
No,
any of
I've
your
hired
campaigns?
people to do it.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool,
yeah,
cool.
yeah, yeah,
I'm
for
sure it was
sure.
high quality. What was the application?
Just like about my agency, like all the different services that we do. Yeah,
Nice.
so
Okay.
yeah, which it's easier because, and we were doing this, early 2000s, I think. So it was really kind of crude, but definitely recognizing that people really want to watch video more so than read. But even though it's still there, right? We still have, millions of billions of blogs, but
Right.
definitely everyone is on YouTube. Everyone is, gravitating to video, right?
So when you
Yeah.
advise your clients, imagine I'm a brand manager and we're just getting to know each other. Where do you direct them in terms of media mix? Do you say like, all right, if you need 100 videos or whatever, how do you tend to kind of chop up the content mix there? And do you say like, these 20 will be talking head with this type of an objective and then break it down in terms of modality?
Well, usually we start off with storytelling, right? Because you're a
Yeah.
strategic storyteller. So that
Yes.
one story, you do it in video, right?
Yes.
Once we have the video, you also have the audio. Then from there, you repurpose it, and then you take that,
Yes.
transcript. And so that's really it comes with telling that right story first, and then repurposing it, in multiple ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I love that. And that's like a model question because what we're seeing now is that if a brand needs 1,000 videos, and we're talking, the Fortune 300, if you will, maybe Fortune 400, but not quite the 500. But if they need several hundred videos or 1,000 or whatever it is for their total, we'll say 2024 mix or whatever they're putting together, what we're starting to prescribe is like this whole subcategory of hand drawn imagery and hand drawn content. And that becomes this kind of extra juice in the creative strategy. So imagine flipping through, and NASA is a customer that does this, right? So you're flipping through and you've got all of these like real life images, you've got drone footage from space. Oh, and then what's that one? And it's somebody actually drawing how a satellite works to get to, because that makes sense, right? Because that's like complicated science. So you'd want to learn something like that from a drawing rather than some computer rendering or something that's very expensive to produce or something that's low grade and doesn't really do the trick. So another example of that, and major shout out to our client at Pega Systems over in the Bay Area. They do a whiteboard concept to describe their new AI products with us, and it's like a rolling series. So you can go to their website and check out all their cool YouTube videos that they have, and then again, there's this little flavor that's illustrated by our studio, and maybe we roll out one every so often, and it's not like they need to be in mass because one good whiteboard video can totally do the trick for an entire product launch. You don't need to do 100 of them. Like you said, get one good one or great one and then chop it up into segments and reappropriate and so on and so forth. But anyway, again, that's where we're seeing the juice right now, is that it's this whole illustrated brand content, but what's your illustrated strategy, so to speak, as like a subgenre of the greater video world, if you will. So anyway, just thought I'd riff there with you for a second.
Definitely. So how did you, I guess, get started with Squiggle AI?
Yeah. So that one was an interesting development. So speaking of college, I was at, again, an interesting nexus between very traditional, like ivory tower academia, like pure academia. Pictured myself to go be a professor in arts, like that was it. And then also this high octane entrepreneurial environment where, the founder of Best Buy attended, famously, the Bill and Melinda Gates family has certain connections, and, so on and so forth, like major companies, major entrepreneurs, and whatever. So it's kind of an interesting place for a arts student to also be, we'll say, talking with business owners and entrepreneurs and whatever. So one of my professors actually became very interested in the project after a few years. I said, hey, we just brought on NASA or something. I can't remember who the client was, but I think it was them. And he took an interest and he said, we should talk more. What are you doing? And tell me about this. And that particular professor then encouraged us to think about serving more users with our IP. So the whole concept that we're talking about here, this illustration in communications, well, how can we offer that to people who can't necessarily work with an agency or don't have time? Or again, go back to the student example, right? Like it's very difficult for a student to work with a professional media agency. Like it just, those are two non sequitur, right? So with that, that meant there was an opening in the market. And by the way, we were getting inquiries, and we still do every single day, to the TruScribe.com website from teachers and students and creators that say, I want to make something with your software. And we're not advertising software anywhere on the website, right? So there's this clear need that people have and continue to have for templates, for pre-drawn illustration, and so on and so forth. But it was around 2015 when this particular professor of mine, basically, actually, he was the one who led as an angel. He led the round, and in like 10 days, we raised over $1 million in seed funding, and basically said, let's do this thing. Let's figure out how to create a software that bottles up the TruScribe approach into a DIY wizard, or in preemptively, it was the concept of generative AI. This term didn't exist, or actually it did, but it was super niche. Like people were barely talking about AI. So generative AI was like,
Exactly. This is 8 years ago.
yeah, you had to be like way in there in the
Wow.
fold to know what was going on.
Yeah.
But I even, by the way, side note, I did a project in 2010 where I was talking about generative art, and so I can send you that after this call. It's wild to see like how far we've come since then. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The concept of generative AI was basically, again, wizard driven, people input text and stuff comes out, right? And that's really where we were. And so in 2016 it was very rudimentary when we got our first like minimum viable product for the software, but that was it. That was the goal, was illustrations are clearly a competitive advantage. If we're only offering them through our agency, then we are leaving, the world at a disservice, right? And the next level after this, by the way, is like book writing and like thought leadership, so if you've got your high value agency services, and then we've got software as a service where people can use templates and a technology to actually create, well, then the next natural step is what we're doing right now, which is kind of spreading that word and spreading the message too, right? So basically 2015 2016 was the inflection point for our technology to move from quote unquote just a manual process into a software and into a technology, like a codified approach, which we then license and sell at scale. And then again, the next step is like the book publication, the podcast presentations that we're doing now, and so on and so forth. And I think that that's actually the highest gain. That's the highest return, because it's not just about a transaction or a customer service ticket being opened and filed or whatever. It's about actual idea exchange. And this is where I feel like the needle moves the most. So thank you for asking such good questions. And it's clear that like we're in sync at a creative level. But do you find the same thing in your experience, that like when we're actually like campaigning, so to speak, is when the most magic happens?
Well, I just love the idea that you're democratizing illustration and visuals. First of all, I just want to just talk
Yeah,
about that,
yeah,
because
please.
being able to offer this, like you said, is such a it really accelerates the power of ideas.
Yes,
Yeah. So,
that's right.
but yeah, when it comes to campaigns, yeah, definitely it has to be integrated. Like you can't just focus on just on one area for it to be really effective.
Right, right. And that's where I'm going with it, is like I feel that democratizing illustration in a communications mode where it's actually effective and impactful, it kind of solves that clip art problem. If you think about clip art from Microsoft Word, you're like dragging and dropping. Love Microsoft. We're a big partner of theirs. But like, we wouldn't be here if this problem didn't need solving, frankly speaking, right? And so the point there is that now we're getting to a level with the technology where it's solving meaningful problems for customers, for end users, for clients, for educators, and so on. And again, that's where the feedback comes in from the marketplace, where I have customer stories to tell. I have like wins to report. Like there's a client of ours in medical technology that hasn't had a down quarter since they started with us. It's like, huh, interesting. That's all I can say there, right? It's like I can't claim performance credit, if you will, for their entire stock price over a 4 or 5 year time period. Of course not. But at the same point, that's a pretty compelling statistic.
And it's because you're providing clarity, right?
Yes.
You're providing clarity, and then also it evokes in them some type of awareness that we really need this, and you're helping them get clients, right? I mean, you're really doing a really beautiful service to them. So it's a medical service company. So is
Yeah,
it
medical
medical
devices.
illustrations?
It's medical devices.
Oh,
And
medical
so
devices.
historically, imagine, somebody says, "Oh, you need whatever it is, doesn't matter, any type of invasive device. It could be a pacemaker, it could be something else." That's nerve wracking, to say the least. It's for many people, it's a total lifestyle change. It's all these things, and so what better way to augment your communications? Again, this doesn't replace, and I'm never here to say, illustration is the only way, because we're not in the Middle Ages anymore, right? It's not that way. Now we use talking head, we use other types of animation, we use screen capture where we need it, of course, and we get this element of illustration, and that becomes your empathetic moment. That becomes the moment where you can say harder things that, again, it softens the blow, if you like, right? There's that. Or it becomes more anonymizing, right? There's no gender necessarily, there's no race necessarily, you can be much more ambiguous, and it doesn't matter who your main character is. Maybe it does, but your creative license is much more open, right? So you don't rely on switch to camera one, we've got our talent on screen, and so on and so forth. Like, that's great for its own applications, absolutely, but it's also very limiting when you think about biases, cognitive biases, telling a story without loading the deck, so to speak, right? So those are some other benefits that we hear back from the client base.
I remember doing a commercial for one of our clients, and the lead girl, who we always use for all the commercials, completely shaved her head when they wanted to do additional commercials. Just like, dang it,
Ooh.
darn it. Like, you can't grow back her hair, so we had to, do something else. But absolutely right. I
That's
mean, you could just add hair. I mean,
hairstyle,
yeah,
facial hair. Somebody shows up with a full beard one day and then shaves it down the next day. What do
exactly.
you do? Right, right, right.
Exactly, exactly. And then you could definitely modernize it much more quickly, because you take a look at some of these iStock photos from a long time ago, like they're useless now, right? Because
Yes.
hairstyles change, clothing changes, makeup changes. So with yours is very fluid.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's another key point, is that, we adapt the illustration style to the brand. And so you'll see, if you look at, certain pharmaceutical clients of ours, you could pick their color, like, miles away. You could say, "Oh, I know who that is," just by looking at one of the accent colors. Well, imagine that in a drawing, the same thing, right, becomes true. You can say, "Wow, right off the bat, we know which brand this fits to." And that's not just pharma, but they seem to have really strong colors. And so that's why that one makes sense. But yep, you nailed it. There's diversity, there's much flexibility, but this universality is what I like to go back to. It's like we're giving something to people that's not just a painkiller or a vitamin. It's like both in all, and moves everything forward together, right? It's like there's benefit and there's alleviation of pain. But anyway, that's what I could wax poetic about for hours and hours. So you certainly have a nerve there.
So you alluded earlier, not alluded, but you're working with a lot of global partners like
Yes.
Microsoft, and also you mentioned NASA, but you also work with Google and Amazon, and you have some important new partner developments. Can you talk about it now, or is it still top secret?
Well, it depends. When do you think this might air?
Whenever you want it
Okay.
to.
Okay. If this is going to air in January or later, then I could
Okay.
tell you for sure that we are working in a new space, which is uh, something that is going to take Squiggle as an authoring tool to the next level, the same way that Copilot by Microsoft, which they just launched, has taken PowerPoint authoring to the next level. And so I'll give you an example. If you're using PowerPoint and you're not familiar with Copilot yet, you can log in and kind of type some words and say, "Hey, create me a PowerPoint that tells such and such a story that fits such and such a brand." And suddenly you have maybe 7 to 10 slides, and they've got information well researched with images and with colors and everything, and it matches what you need, and it's done. Like, that's Copilot. Well, in the Squiggle world, again, assuming this is live by around January or so, you can expect similar quantum leap forward in terms of what's going to be available to the end user. So traditionally, Squiggle is like a wizard where one is typing in words and then the next slide is, or the next screen includes, choose your options and then click next and then click next and then click next. Well, imagine if we're living in a much more dynamic environment than that, and I want to use my illustration within another application, then it becomes more like middleware instead of just like an end user software. And so it becomes more of a iconification engine than anything else. And imagine if that iconification engine is then suddenly available at scale. And so, again, I can't get into too many specifics other than the fact that by the time this airs in January, we can point to squiggle.ai, the domain, which currently is more of a landing page and kind of like an R&D skunk works. But by the time, if you're listening to this and you're like, what the heck is he talking about? The news is live now. Go to squiggle.ai and you should be able to see the changes that I'm talking about. So what that really translates to is partnership at a global level, giving this democratization that you mentioned, and I love that word. Thank you for that. Giving this creative capability to tens of millions at a time instead of, at this point in the early bootstrapping days, right, we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of users at a time. Well, again, just adding some zeros there makes it much more interesting from a distribution perspective. And also, again, delivering on the message is that's huge, is that this purpose is not just, something that's for shareholder value or, just to sell product or whatever. This is actually giving that superpower to more end users around the world at a time where I would argue communication is more important than ever. And so there you go. Without saying too much, I hope.
So, a lot of people are gung ho on AI, but there are also a lot of people who caution about AI. What is your stance on it?
Totally caution, because AI is only as good as what it studies. And so we have to feed it a diverse sample of material. And for, what if we told it, hey, go learn rock and roll music, and we only gave it the Beatles? Like, yeah, that's really great. Love the Beatles. And there's about a million other bands that it should be studying to learn rock and roll music, right? Well, the same example is true, especially in the, we'll say, mission critical world of executive communication, where, again, thinking just about the difference there between that Russian fighter jet and an American F-16 or whatever, this stuff matters a lot. And so the challenge that most AI engineers have to deal with is that their input materials are relegated to the stuff that they have access to on a firsthand level. And so what that means, again, is think about the example of rock and roll music. Most engines for AI are fed from a Western perspective and actually a Californian perspective. And I loved my time in California. I still have family in California, and always have, actually. But the point there is that it's a great culture, but it's not the world. It's totally not. And I think you're in Southern California right now.
That's
Imagine
right.
if, yeah, so imagine if everywhere you went just looked like Southern California. That'd be terrible. That's not the world. That makes Southern
No, it's not.
California way less special, by the way, if the whole world reflects it. It's not what we want. I want to go to Chula Vista or San Diego and enjoy it for what it is. I don't want the whole world to look like it. So that's what we have as a challenge right now, is that when you type in, like a wedding scene, for example, it's always a white wedding, so to speak, and that's not the world by any means. Or you type in faith, and when I type in faith, why should the image be a cross? Like, that's not everybody's faith. Like, nothing wrong with the cross. That's a
Or
great
a dove.
option. Or a dove. Yes, exactly. Right. So this imagery, this iconification that I'm talking about must be global. So that's why I never endorse what you'd call like a first draft publish, if you will, with AI. Like, even if it looks great on first draft through certain tools that are available, or Squiggle or Chat GPT or whatever it is that you like do some editing. Like, that's it, do some editing, and that's where you'll find the magic. It's not just like, because you should push publish. It's not going to reflect what you think it does. That's the challenge I have for a lot of people. Another big one is male female biasy generally. It's this whole concept of like, which I know you've actually had several guests on your show that have talked about this issue of why are men leaders and then women are, it's like a 5 letter word that I'm not going to repeat on this call. But like the difference between candor is, oh yeah, he's such a strong leader, but she is such a blank. And it's like, wait a minute. Well, that same bias exists in AI where you type in traditionally positive words and the images are traditionally, again, very whitewashed, if you will. That's not cool at all. So that's what we're working on and have been since day one, because that particular professor I mentioned, by the way, he has, I think he came over from Jordan in 1977 or 78. And so he has always inspired our company as one of our lead, investors from the early days and visionaries. He's always inspired us to kind of have a multipolar approach. And so that's led me to traveling quite extensively, opening up partnerships in different parts of the world. And that's what made this product a global product from the very beginning. So that when you type in faith, it could be a dove, but it could also be, a crescent moon or a Star of David or a cross, right? So any and that's kind of the point is AI must be universal or it's actually a tool and or it's more of a weapon than a tool, I should say. And that's a bad thing.
Yeah, it needs to grow a conscience.
Yeah, totally. It has to have this omniscience, that's true omniscience for it to be valuable. Have you seen any of those, by the way? Any experience in your playing around with any AI tools where you've been like, whoa, like that should not be
Well, it's
an
like you said
image
the
or a word?
input. They were like, "Oh, is three? Is it what is 3 plus 2?" And they're like, "It's 5." Well, no, it's not 5. And then you start, and then the AI starts apologizing, like, "I'm so sorry, it's not 5.
Yes.
It's really right." Like that's so basic, but like, it's really the input, right? It's really the prompter, the prompt
Yes.
engineer.
You got it. You
Yeah,
got it. So I
yeah.
think there's something to it, and I know that there is. But again, that's a major area of like it's almost like in skiing, it's like a double black diamond or something, right? It's like don't go here if you can't handle it. And like in the coding and the prompt engineering side of things, you're exactly right. Like don't ask it to do 3 plus 2 if you can't if you can't handle it if it tells you 6.
Right. And also, as entrepreneurs who are listening, they still have to be prepared for AI. So, what type of advice would you give them? Uh, do they get educated? What would you do if you were
I
in their
hope
shoes?
I hope I'm repeating a mantra that they've heard already, which would be that AI should not be replacing your staff. Rather, your staff using it should replace redundancy. So that's my way of saying that it, don't look at AI as a way to just cut costs and be done and just move forward, because then you're slashing and burning. You're removing jobs and replacing it with robotic process or rote process. But then you end up with these headlines that don't make sense. And again, there's many examples. Or you end up with this graphic design where the wrong fighter jet nationality is being used or whatever it is, right? And so what we need is more people like you described, prompt engineers, who can actually thoughtfully trigger what the AI is meant to create and meant to do, but do so with the critical lens. And like that's where a liberal arts, a well balanced background in education, a scientific background, right, asking the right questions, knowing creative humanism, if you will, could be having a moment in the next 10 to 20 years, because it all matters and it goes back to our humanity. And those that are simply looking at it from a black and white or ones and zeros perspective, I would say those are the ones that are going to be in trouble. The entrepreneurs who can lean into this humanistic approach and say, yep, we are all humans and we need to make human stuff, and that we have cooler tools to do so, they're the entrepreneurs who are going to win. And even if it's entrepreneurs, and something I love about EO is that we deal with people from basically every industry at every level, right? And so my favorite example is in our local accelerator, where I like to spend some time every now and then. There's a lawn mowing company, right? There's this young entrepreneur, and I think they started out doing a few 100,000 in revenue, like just pure entrepreneurial, 21 years old or whatever. And now it's certainly well into the 7 figures. And he's like a couple years older, but has a lot more going on. And the point there is that even this individual has to use AI or he's not, there's a threat to his business if he doesn't, because he may get surpassed by somebody who is using AI. And that comes down to marketing, that comes down to rote process, that comes down to your accountancy. But again, we can't be suggesting that, the grass cutting entrepreneur all the way to the technologist and the media and the creators and all these people, we can't be suggesting that anybody just rip and replace. So again, that's my point, is that I hope, and perhaps you agree with me, that we're not trying to just replace people with programs, if you will. We're trying to replace lots of work with better tools, and then people who are more equipped to do that work, if that makes sense. Am I resonating, or are you resonating with this?
Absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
or else this time, then we won't be able to, like, as a lawyer, come in front of a judge and with like false cases. You heard about that guy?
Yes, right. That was nuts.
Like,
I did hear about that.
that's just crazy, and then the judge is just like, what are you doing? Like, I mean, you can't outsource that much. You can't outsource your brain, because all that stuff is, made up. There needs
Mhm.
to have some type of sense. Needs to be some type of framework or something to make it accurate, I guess.
Correct. And go back to the Beatles example.
Hmm.
Again, what if the only law that it knows would be American law, and you're practicing in the EU? Like, that's not a good thing. Even the law cases themselves won't work, right? And so, again, that's where the critical aspect becomes huge. And I think that that's the future for entrepreneurs, is to embrace, okay, who can we have using AI, and what will they do with it, versus, again, what is AI going to like detract or take away or somehow damage us, right? So I don't like to be a doomsayer, right? I don't like to be the fear, uncertainty, and all that. I think there are blue skies ahead, and I know that the light is close. I think that we're here. It's just we have to choose the path as entrepreneurs, as you know very, very well. So that would be it, is like thinking strategically about how to use this to best affect the bottom line, to best create customer outcomes. And then the staff, the programs, what we're creating makes more sense. So we'll see what the future holds. That's for sure.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I'm sure that your eighth grade self is probably just so happy that that teacher or professor, I don't know, had that one judgment against you, because look where you are now, right? Our journey isn't a straight line. It is definitely these curves, and it all makes sense now if you look back, like where you're at, right? Like if you had stayed with science only, this whole
Exactly.
art thing would have never ever merged. And now you have these global partnerships and this incredible generative AI software. And I'm really excited to see where you're going to take it
Well,
in 2024.
thank you so much. I appreciate it. And perhaps my invitation to you would be, we can catch up as well on my show, which is called The Drawing Board. Uh,
Ah,
Kind of a
that is
play
so
there.
cute.
But yeah. So
So on
would
brand.
exactly. So would love to get your take maybe in a few months from now, and we can have something air in, if it's January, maybe in like March or something, and
Yeah,
put something together on my platform for you, if that would be, I don't know, an on-air
absolutely.
invitation.
I
So
would
there you
love
go.
that. Thank you,
Super.
AJ.
My
You're
pleasure.
so
It's been
awesome.
been a
Thank
pleasure to
you.
chat. Thanks for your
All
time.
right.
Yep.
Bye, AJ.
Bye now.
Bye.